Ethan Marlowe was never the kind of man to risk his life, but the black envelope on his doorstep that night didn't he feel like a gamble? It felt like a warning. Next to it, caught in the cold wind, was another envelope with the name Claire Hensley written in sharp letters. By the time they understood they weren't the only ones chosen, the doors had already closed. The first game was about to begin. The envelope came quietly, slipped under my apartment door. No stamp, no return address, just my name, written in sharp, thin handwriting. I stared at it for a while before picking it up. It didn't feel like normal paper, it was heavier. Inside was a single black card. On it, 3 shapes sat on top of each other: a triangle, a square, and a circle. At the bottom was a phone number. The numbers seemed to shine in the dim hallway light. I should have thrown it away. Every part of me knew this was bad, but under the shapes was one short line in white text: "Win and claim your prize." The words hooked into me. My rent was late. My fridge was almost empty. My phone bill was past due. I told myself it was probably just a contest or some marketing trick. Maybe a scam, but I wanted to know. That night, after walking in circles around my apartment, I finally called the number. A flat, robotic voice answered. It told me I had been selected and gave me a time and place, 8 p.m. the next day. Then it hung up. The location was an old warehouse at the edge of the city. The streets were darker than usual. Most of the streetlights were broken. The air smelled like rust and oil, mixed with something sweet like fruit left to rot. A black van sat outside the warehouse with its lights off. The windows were too dark to see inside. Without a sound, the side door slid open. It was pitch black inside. A gloved hand reached out not to grab me, but to wave me in. My legs felt heavy, but I stepped in. As soon as I sat down, something cold and metal covered my face. The world went black. When I woke up, I was lying on a cold concrete floor in a massive, bright room. Around me were dozens of people in green tracksuits with white stripes. Each had a number on the chest. Mine was 218. The walls stretched high, painted pure white. At the far end stood people in deep red uniforms, their faces hidden behind black masks. Each mask had either a circle, triangle, or square on it. They stood perfectly still. The only sound was the hum of the lights above. No one spoke. Then, without warning, heavy metal doors opened behind the masked figures. A hallway appeared, bright, colorful, almost like a children's cartoon. The smell of disinfectant drifted toward us. The masked figures raised their hands, telling us to move. We walked forward, our shoes squeaking on the polished floor. The hallway led to a giant playground, blown up to an impossible size. Slides, huge blocks, strange climbing frames. But there was no sound of children, only the steady steps of the guards behind us. Something in my chest tightened. This place was built to keep us here, and whatever game this was, losing wasn't going to mean just losing a prize. We were herded into an even bigger space. The floor was painted green like grass but felt cold and smooth. Above was a blue sky that looked fake, like it was part of a giant ceiling. At the far end stood an enormous doll, facing away from us. Its yellow pigtails were stiff, its dress spotless. Something about how still it stood made my skin crawl. Then a loud siren blasted from hidden speakers. The doll's head began to turn with a slow, grinding sound. Its eyes glowed faint red. A metallic voice filled the air, speaking words I didn't understand. The people around me moved forward. Some quickly, others cautiously. I hesitated, unsure what was happening. Then the doll's head snapped back toward us with a loud click. In that instant, a sound tore through the air, a high, sharp crack like fireworks, followed by sudden screams. Several people collapsed onto the painted grass. At first I thought they'd simply fallen, but then I saw the red spreading under them, dark and heavy, the air filled with the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. My stomach clenched so tightly I could barely breathe. The doll's head turned away again. I realized the rule. Move only when it's not looking. Stop when it turns back. The idea seemed almost absurd, something a child would play. But here, hesitation meant survival. When the voice sounded again, I took a single step forward. My knees wobbled and my feet felt glued to the ground. The doll's head turned again. I froze mid-step, every muscle burning from the effort of staying perfectly still. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground ahead, too afraid to even blink. Time lost all meaning. My entire world shrank to those moments of movement and stillness. Each time the doll's head swung around, another burst of cracks echoed across the field, and more bodies fell. The screams were fewer now, but they cut sharper. The longer I moved, the more the air reeked of blood and fear. By the time I reached the halfway point, my chest was burning from holding my breath. My legs ached, and my back was damp with sweat. I could hear faint sobbing behind me, the sound trembling like a thread about to snap. Ahead, the finish line glowed faintly under the artificial light, just a few more intervals away. When I finally crossed it, the feeling wasn't relief, it was disbelief. My body wanted to collapse, but my mind wouldn't let me. I turned, expecting to see everyone else making their way across, but the field was littered with still forms. Red uniforms moved among them, dragging the bodies away with clinical precision. There was no hesitation, no ceremony, just the quiet scraping of limbs across the painted ground. Above us, a massive black screen lit up showing a number. It represented how many players were left. Nearly half were gone after just one game. The silence among the survivors was heavy, like the air before a storm. No one dared speak. The masked figures led us toward the exit. I kept my eyes on the ground, trying not to look back. But as we passed the door, I caught sight of its face again. Its painted smile was fixed, but its eyes were different now, still glowing faintly, but almost aware. For a second, I swore its gaze followed me, even though its head never moved. As we neared the steel door at the far end, I noticed something strange behind the glass window beside it. Pressed against the inside was a pale, twitching hand, the fingers bent at unnatural angles, as though broken. But they still moved, curling and uncurling slowly. Before I could make sense of it, the door slammed shut. The echo followed me long after we left the field. We were taken to a dormitory that looked like it had been built for function, not comfort. The walls were bare, concrete, cold and unwelcoming. Metal bunk beds stretched from one end of the massive room to the other, stacked so high I couldn't see the top without craning my neck. The light was harsh and constant, bright enough to burn my eyes after a while. There were no windows, no clocks, nothing to mark the passage of time. It felt like we had been sealed inside a place where day and night no longer existed. The smell was a mix of sweat, metal, and something faintly chemical. I climbed to the middle bunk assigned to me and sat there, feeling the mattress springs dig into my back. Around me, the others moved in silence. A few lay down, staring at the ceiling with wide, empty eyes. Others sat on their bunks, heads in their hands. It felt wrong to speak, as if words might wake something lurking just out of sight. Food was brought in not long after. Small metal trays with a piece of bread, a boiled egg and a bottle of water. The bread was damp and slightly sour, the egg rubbery, the water carrying a faint smell of bleach. I forced it down, knowing I needed the strength. Some players refused to eat. By morning their bunks were empty, the sheets stripped away. No one asked where they had gone. A loud clang echoed through the dorm, making everyone tense. The red uniformed workers filed in, their masked faces unreadable. They herded us through a hallway and into the next game room. The space was brightly lit, but smelled faintly of burnt sugar. At the front was a giant wall painted with 4 simple shapes: a star, a circle, an umbrella, and a triangle. We were each handed a small round tin. Inside was a thin slab of honeycomb candy with one of the shapes pressed into it. Mine was a triangle. The rules appeared on a screen above. Carve your shape out without breaking the candy. Fail, and you were eliminated. It seemed absurdly easy at first, but then the first loud crack sounded from somewhere to my right. A man had broken the tip of his star. The reaction was immediate. A worker stepped forward, raised a pistol, and fired. The man's body fell limp to the floor. Panic rippled through the room. Hands began to shake. Breaths came quicker, and the sound of tiny fractures snapping echoed all around. I gripped my needle and focused on the candy in front of me, tracing the lines slowly, trying not to think about the bodies hitting the ground. My mouth was dry, my heartbeat deafening in my ears. Minutes stretched like hours. Every time I thought I might slip, I forced myself to stop and breathe. The edge of my triangle was thin and fragile, but finally, I freed it from the slab without a single crack. I placed it carefully on the table, my hands trembling uncontrollably. One by one, the survivors finished. The floor was littered with shards of candy and lifeless bodies. The smell of burnt sugar mixed with the metallic temps of blood clinging to my throat. The masked workers moved with cold efficiency, dragging the dead toward a side door. As we were being led out, I made the mistake of glancing back. That's when I saw one of the bodies twitch. It wasn't a reflexive spasm, it was deliberate. The fingers curled slightly, then the head turned a fraction toward me. Its eyes were half open, clouded and unfocused, yet still moving. The worker dragging the body didn't seem to notice. The limp figure was pulled through the side door and disappeared from sight. I kept walking, my pulse hammering. Whatever I had just seen didn't belong in the realm of normal death. Back in the dormitory, the bunks were rearranged. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I tried to rest, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cloudy gaze staring at me, unblinking from the floor of the game room. The days, or what I assumed were days, blurred together. In that place, there was no sunlight to measure time, no natural rhythm to follow. The bright lights never dimmed, and the silence between games felt heavier than the games themselves. People began to change. Some whispered in corners, glancing around as though the walls could hear. Others stayed completely still on their bunks, staring at nothing for hours. Trust became dangerous. The next game took place in a cavernous space where the air felt damp and cold. A narrow bridge stretched high above a pit so deep I couldn't see the bottom. The bridge was made of 2 parallel paths of glass panels, each step either solid or fragile enough to shatter under the weight of a single person. We were told nothing, but the meaning was obvious. Choose wrong, and you fall. The person in front of me hesitated, shifting their weight nervously. Finally, they stepped onto the left panel. It held. They took another step, this time on the right hand. It shattered instantly. Their scream echoed endlessly, fading into nothing. My stomach twisted. The next player moved carefully, testing each panel with their foot before committing. The air was filled with the sound of nervous breaths and the occasional shattering glass. When it was my turn, my palms were slick with sweat. The first step was safe. The second was safe. My third choice was wrong. My foot pressed lightly onto a panel that cracked beneath me. The sound sharp and final. I jerked back just in time, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Somehow, step by step, I made it across. When my feet hit solid ground, I felt no relief, only exhaustion. The survivors stood in a small cluster, watching the rest attempt their luck. More bodies fell than crossed. The final jump to safety felt less like victory and more like escaping a mouth that had almost closed around me. That night in the dormitory, sleep felt impossible. I lay on my side, staring into the shadows under my bed. That was when I heard a faint scraping, like nails dragging slowly against concrete. I froze. The sound grew louder, steady, deliberate. My breathing became shallow, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I leaned over the edge of the bed, and my blood turned cold. Staring back at me from the darkness was a face. It was pale and bloodless, its lips pulled into a wide, unnatural smile that revealed teeth far too sharp. The eyes were milky, almost white, but they moved slowly, tracking my head as I peered down. We stayed like that for what felt like minutes, neither of us moving. Then, without a sound, the face began to sink backward into the shadows, disappearing entirely. The scraping stopped. I sat back quickly, pressing my back to the wall. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep them still. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of exhaustion and fear. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Others must have felt it too. The next morning, no one spoke, but I saw the same restless fear in their eyes. A few players avoided looking under their bunks altogether. One man refused to lie down at all, standing in the corner with his back against the wall until we were summoned again. By then, the group had thinned to a fraction of what it had been. The masked workers didn't seem to notice or care. Every time a player vanished, their number on the black screen above simply disappeared, replaced by silence. When the lights dimmed slightly for the first time since I'd arrived, I thought maybe it was a sign of night. But then I saw movement in the corners of the room, just beyond the edges of light, shapes too tall to be human, shifting slowly, like they were waiting. I kept my eyes down, pretending not to see, but I could feel them there, watching, patient. Whatever they were, I knew they weren't part of the games. They were something else entirely. Only a small handful of us remained, our numbers so reduced that the dormitory felt like an echo of itself. The bunks that once groaned under the weight of bodies now stood empty. Sheets stripped away, metal frames reflecting the harsh light. The air felt colder, heavier. I barely recognized the faces of the other survivors. Their expressions were blank, drained of anything human, as if the games had already hollowed them out. The final game took place in a space unlike any of the others. We stepped into an open courtyard under a sky that wasn't quite right. It was cloudless but unnervingly dark, the stars faint and distant, like they had been painted on. The ground was wet, though there was no rain. Puddles reflected the dim light above, but when I looked into them, my reflection was delayed, moving a second after I did. The masked figures surrounded the courtyard in a perfect circle, each standing utterly still. Their masks caught the light, hiding their faces entirely. The space was silent except for the faint drip of water somewhere unseen. No rules were explained. No countdown began. Then, a single gunshot echoed. The sound bounced off the courtyard walls, sharp and hollow. The player nearest to me bolted in panic, running toward one of the walls. I followed instinctively, but something was wrong. The wall didn't get closer, no matter how many steps we took. The ground beneath my shoes didn't even feel like concrete anymore, more like rubber, soft and unsteady. One by one, the others began to disappear. It wasn't immediate or dramatic. They would be there one moment, and then the shadows around their feet would rise and swallow them whole. There was no scream, no struggle, just absence. I saw a woman ahead of me vanish mid, her outline fading as though she had never been real. The puddles on the ground began to ripple, even though there was no wind. I looked down and saw my own reflection smiling up at me, not the tight, fearful grimace I felt on my face, but a wide, slow smile that stretched too far. Its eyes were dark hollows, and as it moved I realized it wasn't following my movements anymore. It was beckoning me closer. I stumbled backward, but the air itself seemed to resist me, heavy and pressing against my chest. The masked figures stepped forward in unison, their boots hitting the wet ground with perfect rhythm. They closed in until they formed a tight circle around me. My breath quickened, my throat dry. One of them broke the circle and stepped directly in front of me. Slowly it raised its hands and removed its mask. My knees almost gave way. I was staring at my own face, not just a copy, but me, down to the smallest detail. The skin was pale, stretched tight, and the smile was identical to the one I'd seen in the puddle. It tilted its head slightly, as though studying me. I wanted to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. It stepped closer until its face was inches from mine. Then, without warning, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the dormitory again. The bunks were full, every bed occupied by people I'd never seen before. Their eyes were wide and confused, the same way mine had been when I first woke here. I looked down and saw a different number stitched onto my tracksuit. The giant black screen on the wall flashed to life, displaying the total number of players. The masked workers filed in, herding the newcomers toward the first game. I stayed in my bunk, heart pounding, because I understood now. I hadn't escaped, I hadn't even survived. The games had started over and I was still inside.